Welcome, friends. My name is Michael Bawtree, and I'm telling you this story because 50 years ago, as a young officer serving in Cyprus, I knew and revered 4 of the men who took part in it. Their exploits were a founding myth for us young subalterns of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, otherwise known as the 43rd and 52nd of Foot. One of them was my company commander, and though I was only a lowly National Service conscript, he and his family became my friends for life. Of those 4 soldiers, one is still with us and has helped me with this undertaking. I'm happy to be attempting to recreate that fateful night for the sake of these, my fellow soldiers, half a century ago, and for all those many others who shared in the adventure. Because I've spent my life working as a writer, actor, and director in the theatre, I feel particularly proud to be reviving the role of the epic poet of old who picked up his lyre and sang of the exploits of the mighty heroes of Greece and Troy. You'll be relieved to know I have no lyre with me and do not intend to sing, not much anyway, but we may be hearing some music of a different kind. So, once upon a time. We could trace tonight's story far back almost to the beginnings of our written history, when a Roman invasion force crossed the English Channel under Julius Caesar. But let's start in 1066, when yet another invading army, this time the Normans, established their beachhead at Hastings, killed King Harold, and founded a dynasty under William I, William the Conqueror. But there was one major difference between his invasion and the one we commemorate tonight. William crossed from the mainland of Europe to the scattering of offshore islands now called Britain and Eire. There were later attempts in the same direction, notably the Spanish with their Armada in 1588 and Napoleon's abortive plans to invade in 1803. And there were plenty of marauding raids like the Dutch sweeping up the Thames in 1667 and destroying many ships of the Royal Navy. But after 1066, no hostile army ever again landed on British soil, unless they came to press claims to the throne of England, like William of Orange in 1688. Even William the Conqueror gave this as his excuse for invasion. Tonight, though, we celebrate an engagement which began with a crossing from the British Isles to the mainland of Europe. Did earlier invasion forces ever cross in the same direction? Of course they did. The Black Prince and Henry V, the Duke of Marlborough and the Duke of Wellington were just some of the generals who headed armies onto the mainland where they fought decisive battles. Of all these campaigns, the one that has almost epic status for us is Henry V's, when he lay siege to Harfleur and led his sick and exhausted men to victory at Agincourt. The reason, of course, is that this adventure was put on stage by William Shakespeare. The English Channel features in the very first prologue. Suppose within the girdle of these walls are now confined 2 mighty monarchies, whose high upreared and abutting fronts the perilous narrow ocean parts asunder. Managing to cross the perilous narrow ocean successfully, Henry, in his speech to his men before Harfleur, gives them the very model of all pep talks. Once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more, or close the wall up with our English dead. I see you stand like greyhounds in the slips, straining upon the start. The game's afoot. Follow your spirit, and upon this charge cry God for Harry, England, and St. George. Like all war leaders, from Agamemnon to Field Marshal Haig to George W. Bush, Henry trusts that God is on his side. But Shakespeare's play is not a glorification of war for its own sake. walking around his camp the night before the great battle, Henry comes upon ordinary soldiers discussing just this question. "If the cause be not good," says Michael Williams, "the king himself hath a heavy reckoning to make. There be few die well that die in a battle." Henry is tormented by the responsibility of risking his men's lives if the cause be not just. "Upon the king let us our lives, our souls, our debts, our careful wives, our children, and our sins lay on the king. We must bear all. O hard condition." Henry's cause, just or not, was to win back possession of his French lands won through past marriages. In fact, as a result of his victories, he was the only British king ever made heir to the throne of France, though he died before he could claim both mighty monarchies. The Duke of Marlborough crossed the same perilous narrow ocean to fight French interests in the War of Spanish Succession in the early 18th century, winning his greatest victory at Blenheim. The French Revolution threw up a different enemy in the person of Napoleon Bonaparte, and to oppose him, Sir John Moore in 1808 led an army to Spain, where he died in the retreat to Corunna. Not a drum was heard, not a funeral note, as his course to the rampart we hurried. Wellington replaced Moore and slowly rolled back the French armies of occupation from Portugal and Spain, then drove them north to Napoleon's abdication in Paris, and finally, after Napoleon's escape from Elba and briefly becoming emperor again, to the Battle of Waterloo. Britain's attempts to balance off the major European powers led to another fairly horrifying engagement in the Crimea in the 1850s, the first war to be photographed. We wonder how much those armies knew what they were fighting for and whether the cause was just. Certainly the Light Brigade didn't know when, as the result of a misunderstood order, they rode into the enemy's cannon and back again. In Tennyson's famous poem, "There's not to reason why, there's but to do and die." And they did. But with Britain's trade empire expanding, her armies were already sailing much further afield than the continent of Europe. Many battles were fought to gain or regain control of territories which had been wrested from their original inhabitants and then fought over by the competing colonial powers, above all France, Spain, Portugal, and Holland. So my own adopted country, Canada, was won from the French by General Wolfe on the Heights of Abraham in 1759. And it was not long after this that Britain found itself fighting wars to try to hold on to her own colonial so-called possessions. Of these, the most significant was the lost War of American Independence. But all through the 19th century, the campaigns had moved to India, to Afghanistan, to China, to Africa. New territories were won, and battles won and lost. And then, last century, the competitive trade and territorial pressures of Europe exploded out of the Balkans in the First World War. British forces crossed the Channel in their millions to join France in a hideous trench war against Germany, while Russia and Italy matched themselves against Austro-Hungary and Turkey, with Australian, New Zealand, and British troops attempting to outflank them in the disaster of Gallipoli. And by the end of this horrendous conflict, only 10 years after the miraculous invention of flight, aerial combat and bombing had been added to the lexicon of battle, and that perilous, narrow ocean no longer guarded the fortress of England against infection and the hand of war. But of course, in the air, as on the sea, the narrow oceans could be crossed in both directions, as we shall see. So, why am I starting out with this pocket history? Because running like a thin scarlet thread through the last 250 years of this tapestry is the story of a regiment, a family of soldiers who from generation to generation fought and died in its battles. The regiment we're focusing on tonight is the 52nd of Foot. Can we summarize a regiment's long history in just a few words? No. But they were first raised in 1755. In 1881, they became the 43rd and 52nd of Foot, and in 1908 were named the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, the title under which they served in both World Wars and until 1958, when they became part of the Green Jackets Brigade. They became the 1st Battalion of the Royal Green Jackets in 1966, which last year was absorbed into the newly formed Rifle Regiment as its 4th Battalion. Through these many campaigns all over the world, the 52nd did as they were bidden by their sometimes brilliant, sometimes confused generals and commanding officers, and by their often confused governments of the day. The cause was sometimes a fine one, like the final defeat of the monstrous genius Napoleon. But it was often to protect Britain's merchant navy, or to knock out ancient inhabitants of conquered lands, or to suppress threats to the vast British Empire by beating out rival trading nations. Though modern hindsight sees these imperialist engagements as morally dubious, there was little doubt at the time that whatever the king or queen demanded of a soldier must be, in the words of 1066 and all that, a good thing. And of course, the empire in its day was believed to be a good thing too. The 52nd of Foot, along with their fellow battalions of the 43rd, played a major role in Flanders and France in the First World War, crossing that perilous, narrow ocean sometimes more than once, from the anxious but peaceful world of Great Britain to the living hell of Nonniboshen, Ypres, Passchendaele, and the Menin Road, where so many perished. In Wilfred Owen's words, "No mockery now for them, no prayers, no bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells, and bugles calling for them from sad shires." The regiment also served in Macedonia, and lost an entire battalion in Mesopotamia, now Iraq, against Germany's ally, Turkey, the Ottoman Empire. Following the war to end all wars, the 52nd was sent briefly to Ireland and then to India, where it stayed until 1940, reinforcing the Indian Army in their efforts to hold down the growing struggle for independence. But while they were fox hunting and downing their chota pegs in Rawalpindi and other places, all was not well back in Europe. The Treaty of Versailles of 1919 had unraveled. Germany's huge reparations requirements had beggared the country, increasingly split among a powerful communist faction supported by the new USSR, a social democratic party, and an extreme nationalist movement led by one Adolf Hitler. England and France, exhausted by their efforts in the First World War, had allowed their military strength to decline. They couldn't face the prospect of more warfare and were reluctant to enforce the punitive terms of the Versailles Treaty. When Hitler was narrowly elected Chancellor of Germany in 1933, there were even many British who saw him as a savior of his country. And though he immediately embarked on his campaign to burn books, to suppress communists, Jews, gypsies, and homosexuals, to rebuild the German army, navy, and air force in contravention of Versailles, and to gather and display his increasingly numerous zealots in fearsome events like the Nuremberg Rally, well, at least he got Germany's economy functioning again, didn't he? Winston Churchill's repeated warnings during the 30s fell largely on deaf ears. Winston was in the wilderness with neither power nor credibility within his own party. He was seen as an unstable warmonger. It was Hitler's policy of territorial expansion which finally forced England and France into action, and then only after letting Austria be overrun and Czechoslovakia be thrown to the wolves the same year. Italy, under Mussolini, had now joined forces with Hitler in the Rome-Berlin axis. And in August 1939, to the shock and horror of socialists all over the world, the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler, including a secret agreement on how to carve up the Baltic states and Poland between them. In response to the Czech dismemberment, England and France had guaranteed the integrity of the Polish state. So when Hitler marched and flew into Poland, Britain and France had no alternative but to declare war on Germany and its allies. The Second World War had begun, September the 3rd, 1939. Was the cause good? Well, there were many to blame for things coming to such a pass at the end of the 30s, but you'll find very few who doubt that once Hitler was launched on his murderous plans for the world, he could be stopped only by force of arms. Yes, of all wars ever fought, this was and is reckoned to be a just war, a war to save civilization itself. France mobilized, and before the end of the month, Britain's expeditionary force had begun crossing the Channel to protect Belgium and France. A few months followed, known as the Phony War. Then, in April, Hitler invaded Denmark and Norway, and on the 10th of May 1940, the German army struck, unleashing their western offensive through Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg, and on into France. On the very same day, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. His message for the House of Commons and for the country was a somber one. "We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind, but I take up my task with buoyancy and hope. I feel sure that our cause will not be suffered to fail among men. Let us go forward with our united strength." Less than 4 weeks later, driven into a pocket against the sea, Britain had evacuated nearly 250,000 of its own soldiers, including a battalion of the 43rd, and over 100,000 French and Belgian troops, that spectacular defeat known as the Miracle of Dunkirk. All heavy equipment was left behind. By the end of June, the Wehrmacht had occupied Paris, and the French had capitulated. Immediately, Hitler launched preparations for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. Churchill again. "Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war." Before invading, the Nazi forces had to win supremacy in the skies. The Battle of Britain followed, in which a few hundred gallant fighter pilots held the Luftwaffe at bay and are credited with saving the country from invasion. In the immortal words of Churchill, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." In September, Hitler launched his devastating blitz against London, but he postponed his invasion and attacked Romania. The following year, he broke his non-aggression pact and turned his forces against Soviet Russia, striking through Poland and Hungary. The idea of a gallant few who by their heroism have saved the many goes back into the distant history of warfare. From the 300 Spartans who perished holding the pass at Thermopylae, to the single runner speeding from Marathon to Athens to bring news of the Greek land victory and the approaching Persian fleet, to Horatius holding the bridge and saving Rome, to Henry V's "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers." Because even when vast numbers of troops are being maneuvered across the landscape, or huge fleets sail the seas, or mass in the skies, there are always those moments when a small group, even a single individual, or a ship, or a plane, happens to have a huge outcome depend on their actions at a critical moment, at a critical place. This is one of those stories. You may wonder why we're beginning on such a vast canvas in time and space, but our story only makes sense in the context of the world events that swung around it. This is like one of those films in which the camera begins by revealing a vast panoramic landscape, and then slowly, not too slowly in this case I hope, zooms in to one tiny detail. By August of 1940, in Churchill's own words, the whole western seaboard of Europe, from the North Cape to the Spanish frontier, was in German hands. Most of France, all Belgium, Holland, Denmark, and Norway were overrun. Western Poland and Czechoslovakia were satellites. Greece, Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria were soon to be conquered. Britain stood alone. And even if it was their finest hour, how on earth could one imagine that the tide could ever be reversed? And yet, from the very first, there was a determination that someday, somehow, that perilous, narrow ocean would be crossed from west to east or north to south, and that Hitler's mighty divisions would be confronted and finally pushed back to Germany. Churchill's instructions to his planners were clear. You are to prepare for the invasion of Europe. You must devise and design the appliances, the landing craft, and the technique. The whole of the south coast of England is a bastion of defense against the invasion of Hitler. You've got to turn it into the springboard for our attack. The 52nd Light Infantry, returning from India in 1940, expected to be sent out to Belgium immediately, but the British Expeditionary Force was evacuated from Dunkirk a few weeks before they arrived in Liverpool. As a battalion at full strength and in fighting trim, they were a valuable resource, and in the next year and more were attached to an independent brigade and pushed around the country to fill gaps and prepare for Hitler's invasion. As the months went by, they became more and more impatient to see action, but in October 1941, with the German invasion plans now apparently shelved, they were informed that the brigade was to be converted to an air landing brigade within a newly formed 1st Airborne Division. Airborne operations were a fairly recent development in European warfare. Companies of Hitler's paratroopers had been dropped and landed in gliders effectively in the invasions of Denmark and Norway, and then in Holland and Belgium. The next year, both gliders and paratroopers were extensively employed in the invasion of Crete. It was a successful mission, but the Germans suffered very heavy losses, and apparently Hitler, not known to be squeamish, was horrified and forbade further airborne operations. Meanwhile, the British, who were not remarkable for forward thinking in the 1930s, had developed no air landing capacity of any sort before the war. They now, under Churchill's prodding, decided they must get into the game, and that is why, at the end of 1941, we see the 52nd, now officially part of an airborne division, moving to a mushroom farm near Basingstoke to begin training. No one being entirely sure of their mission, they were simply ordered to achieve extraordinary individual fitness with PT, road walks, runs, swimming lessons, and forced marches. Then, in April, they joined the rest of the new airborne division in Bulford to begin air training. On their sleeves, they wore flashes bearing the figure of the winged horse Pegasus, the badge which, legend has it, was proposed by the novelist Daphne du Maurier, whose husband was the dashing General Boy Browning, first commander of the airborne division. Meanwhile, huge events were unrolling across the Channel and further afield. Hitler's Operation Barbarossa bit deep into Soviet Russia. The Japanese overran the Far East and then, in December 1941, had struck the American fleet, bringing the United States into the war. The British faced first Italy in North Africa and then Rommel, with American forces joining Montgomery and the Eighth Army to fight and win their first engagements against Hitler. The United States had wanted to attack across the Channel in 1942, soon after they joined the European War, but were persuaded by the British that it was too soon, that it would be a catastrophic disaster. In 1942 and again 1943, Stalin was calling bitterly for a second front to be opened in the West to take the pressure off his grievously suffering armies and nation. It was still considered too soon for this, but preparations were finally in hand, and one of the weapons of the planned invasion was to be airborne. Other units of the 1st Airborne Division were mobilized in the glider and paratrooper attack on Sicily in April 1943. The attack was ultimately successful, but 75 gliders ditched into the sea. The 1st Air Landing Brigade lost 250 drowned and a further 50 missing, with 60 killed on land. Even now there is real distress at what seems to have been insufficient planning and training for the operation, although weather was also to blame. If there was anything to be taken away from the disaster, it was to the advantage of the 52nd and the newly created 6th Airborne Division, of which they were now a part. Many painful lessons were learned. And now it is time to introduce some of the principal participants in the story of Pegasus and Horsa bridges. Among the new men joining the regiment in early 1941 was one John Howard, recently a regimental sergeant major and then a commissioned officer with the King's Shropshire Light Infantry Reserve Battalion, then a bobby with the Oxford City Police, and now commissioned into the Oxford Bucks, where, as a Cockney boy promoted from the ranks, he at first found himself out of place in the huntin', shootin' and fishin' officers' mess of the old county regiment. But his dedication was soon recognized, and at the end of 1941 he was promoted first to captain and then to major and given his own command, D Company. His second in command was Brian Priday. His platoon commanders were Den Brotheridge, Tony Hooper, Harry Sweeney, of course nicknamed Todd, and the 19-year-old David Wood, fresh out of officer training. He later had 2 other platoons transferred to his command from B Company. One of them was commanded by Sandy Smith, the other by Dennis Fox. And here I need one more time to interject a personal note. When I came ashore at Limassol, Cyprus in January 1957 from the good ship Asturias to join the 1st Battalion Oxford and Bucks, I found myself attached to A Company, commanded by one Todd Sweeney, by this time Major Todd Sweeney, MC. The military attaché to Field Marshal Lord Harding and then Sir Hugh Foote, Britain's Governors-General in Cyprus, was one Major Dennis Fox, MBE, who paid frequent visits to the battalion. Soon to be second in command of our battalion was Major David Wood, and our signals colour sergeant was Bill Bailey. All of these gentlemen took part in the event we commemorate tonight, and it was not long before Todd Sweeney, on some company exercise up in the hills of Cyprus, was persuaded by his young officers one evening by the campfire to tell the story of the capture of Pegasus and Horsa bridges. At that time his war exploits seemed to hail from the very distant past, and we both admired him for his old soldier reminiscences and also teased him. We were also taken well aback by learning that he had been a novice monk, leaving his monkish habit at the start of the war to enlist against the Führer, and later marrying his lovely wife Geraldine. He is, in fact, the only British soldier I have ever heard referred to as a saint. Being something of a songwriter and performer, I wrote a song about the Pegasus Bridge operation. It was a time when some of our older officers were being offered early retirement, and I also put together a song imagining our senior colleagues lining up us outside Locke's the Hatter on St. James to receive their golden bowlers. Oh, 43rd and 52nd gentlemen, I see you with tears in your eyes. Oh, 43rd and 52nd gentlemen, with your 43rd and 52nd ties. I'm proud to say that the 43rd and 52nd tie I'm wearing tonight belonged to Todd Sweeney, and I wear it with pride. From Todd, we first learnt of the somewhat fearsome Major John Howard and his part in the Pegasus Bridge operation, to which we now return. Howard was determined from the beginning that his company, D Company, was to be the best. In the words of David Wood, I quickly learned that letter D Company had to be the best at everything: shooting, football, boxing, cross-country running, and above all, marching. We marched for miles. My feet still feel sore when I go anywhere near Bulford. One standard test was 25 miles in 6 hours in full battle order. John was really obsessed with fitness. Howard's mania for fitness, for which, of course, he was his own supreme example, was described as beyond anything the British Army had ever seen before. He was dealing with a company that was waiting to see some action, and was always aware that boredom and frustration were in the air as the months went by. One time the regiment was sent down to Devon for 2 months of rock climbing, and then ordered to march back the 130 miles to Bulford. Howard strode alongside his company, pushing them on. On the 4th day, 2 of his soldiers, Bill Bailey and Wally Parr, came out in parade on their knees. Howard asked them what the blazes they were doing, and they replied they had worn away the bottom half of their legs. But they marched on. Mad bastard, they muttered, but they marched, and D Company came in half a day ahead of the rest of the regiment. From then on they were the shining lights of the battalion, and could do nothing wrong. When a race was held to sort out the best runners in the whole brigade, D Company put in 20 runners, and they took 15 of the first 20 places. Since the regiment was being prepared for glider operations, gliders were naturally a major part of their training. They soon discovered the discomfort of being towed along behind a tug plane. General Crookenden described the sensation. Since the glider on the end of its tug rope moved in a series of surges as the tug rope tightened and slackened, and was subjected to the normal pitching, rolling, and yawing of any aircraft, few survived more than half an hour without being sick. The floor was soon awash with vomit. Howard himself was one of the worst affected, and not surprisingly rehearsed his men relentlessly in exit drill on landing. Until you're out of there, he barked, you're rats in a trap. During 1942 and 1943, British woodworkers were being brought into the business of making gliders, which were mostly put together of plywood and glue, and have been described as the most wooden aircraft ever built. Even the controls were of wood. The trick was to make them disposable, as we would say today, while preserving their human contents. The preferred model, which began delivery in the summer of 1943, was the Horsa, capable of carrying a pilot and co-pilot and 28 men in battle order, or a quarter-ton truck, or a howitzer. As the months of 1943 went by, the men of the 52nd glider-borne companies became increasingly frustrated, and all their commanders, but especially John Howard, continued to devise exercises, sports events, and forced marches to occupy their time. Howard even took his men on street fighting practices, working with live ammunition in bombed-out areas of Southampton, Portsmouth, and London. All of them were aware that the War Office would not be putting so much energy into the brigade's training unless some special mission was being planned for them. It had to be connected with the approaching invasion, they guessed, and it might well involve landing behind enemy lines. They were right. 1944. February the 26th, Major General Boy Browning visits regiment, lectures officers and senior NCOs on invasion setup. March the 8th, Montgomery inspects division. March the 23rd, John Howard briefed on a full-scale divisional exercise. D Company to land in gliders near 3 small bridges in Lechlade and capture them intact. March 25th, to Lechlade for 3-day exercise Biz. D Company dropped in area by truck, no glider landing space available, to capture bridges from dummy enemy and hold until relieved by battalion under Colonel Roberts. General Windy Gale observing. March 28th, home leave for regiment. April the 8th, leave cancelled. April the 15th, morning, debriefing from exercise Biz. Howard and D Company praised for verve in taking bridges and tenacity in holding them. April 15th, afternoon, Colonel Roberts calls for Major Howard, tells him his company has been chosen to capture 2 bridges at start of invasion. Roberts: you realize, John, that your company will be the spearhead of the invasion. It is a great honor for the regiment to be selected to find troops for this highly important job. But I feel absolutely confident that you will be able to pull it off. Howard: yes, sir. You can have every confidence in me and my men. And John, you realize that this information is top secret? Yes, sir. April the 18th. Exercise Mush in Gloucestershire against a Polish enemy. D Company to attack and capture 2 bridges. Mission successful. May 2nd, Howard put on X list and given outline of British plan for invasion of Europe. Invasion to land not at the Pas de Calais, as expected by the Germans, but on the beaches of Normandy. 6th Airborne's task, to protect left or eastern flank of the Allied bridgehead in Normandy. Howard's written instructions to seize intact bridges over Caen Canal, Bénouville, and River Orne at Ranville. Hold until relieved by 7th Parachute Battalion. Current bridges defense, garrison of 50 German troops. 1 German battalion in area with tanks. 1 Panzer Division in Caen. Bridges wired for demolition, surprise therefore essential. Noise of aircraft dropping paratroops would reveal attack, and bridges would be blown before troops could muster. Therefore, gliders to be used. 6 gliders to land as close as possible to bridges, each carrying platoon of men to capture bridges, and 5 sappers to dismantle demolition charges. Howard shown aerial photographs and detailed model of target area and instructed to prepare plan. May the 5th, Howard presents his plan to Colonel Roberts. 3 platoons are assigned to each bridge. Canal Bridge platoons under Major Howard, River Bridge platoons under Captain Brian Priday. Plan takes into account that any glider may land first and nearest either target. All platoons must therefore be prepared to initiate any of the phases of the operation. To avoid friendly fire in the dark, each platoon to run across bridges shouting the letter of their platoon, A, B, C, D, E, F. Abel, Baker, Charlie, Dog, Easy, Fox. By chance, Dennis Fox's is F platoon. Roberts reviews plan. Sound as a bell, says Roberts. Training continues. May the 18th, all 186 assault troops, infantry and engineers assembled for the first time for training together. May the 19th, King and Queen, accompanied by Princess Elizabeth, visits division. May 21st, move to Devon to practice on 2 bridges similar to French targets. Each platoon to take turns with each task. Brigadier Nigel Poet, Commander 5th Para Brigade, and Brigadier Kindersley, Air Landing Brigade Commander, turn up to watch. Umpires in attendance to adjudicate casualties. May 24th, invasion of city of Exeter for a last stupendous pub crawl before returning to barracks. No one allowed to pay for drinks. Police involved. No charges laid. May 26th, D Company sent to transit camp at Tarrant Rushton, Dorset. Surrounded by barbed wire, sentries on the gate. No letters, no phone calls, unable to leave until D-Day, whenever that is. May 27th, Howard given permission to brief his platoon commanders and show them the model of the bridge area. May 28th, all ranks shown the model. May the 29th, glider pilots arrive. June the 1st, all men briefed on details of operation. Address by Colonel Roberts, the 52nd Battalion commander. June the 3rd, men raring to go. Address by Brigadier Kindersley, cheered by the troops. June the 4th, code word Cromwell received. The invasion is on for tonight. D Company makes ready. But weather deteriorates through the day. Heavy rain and gales. Afternoon, word arrives, entire invasion cancelled due to weather conditions. So, it is the night of the 4th of June, 1944. 130,000 troops, carried in or supported by 9 battleships, 23 cruisers, 104 destroyers, and 71 large landing craft of various descriptions, as well as troop transports, minesweepers, and merchantmen, in all nearly 7,000 ships of every type, are poised to cross the narrow ocean, the largest invasion force mankind has ever seen. They are supported by a fleet of 12,000 aircraft. But the ocean tonight is altogether too perilous. The gales continue with a heavy 5-foot swell in the channel. The Supreme Commander, General Eisenhower, and his staff agonize, afraid to lose the element of surprise, but afraid to compromise the invasion by launching it in fearful weather. The men of D Company watch a film, or down a few beers, or try to rest. The young platoon commanders, it is on record, sink a bottle of whiskey between them. Major John Howard sleeps not at all. The world waits, and here and now let us wait too. For when we come back, you will find us stepping out of history and into the world of the epic story of Pegasus Bridge.